Hey there. So, first off, thanks for your patience. It's been a little bit since I've posted, in large part because it's been a pretty busy month for me. But then when that busyness did lapse a little bit, I wasn't really in any shape to post. I had to wait till I calmed down a bit. I know I'm not the only person who has had their worldview and their optimism a little shaken up since, say November. And every so often, the stupid shit and, frankly, complete moral depravity just fucks me up all over again. And as a general rule, if I'm not in terribly great personal shape, I frankly should be focusing on myself and not necessarily posting videos, particularly when there's a risk of my own negativity, bitterness, or anger being transmitted in an unproductive way to people who innocently click on a link hoping that they'll get something informative, interesting, maybe a little upbeat. All of which is to say, this isn't a venue that I want to use to vent. But this experience does highlight, I think, something that it's probably worth chatting about for a couple of minutes. And that is some of my ideas and approaches to dealing with what is effectively a mix of heartbreak and rage, when the usual tricks that I use aren't cutting it just then. In general, the YouTube pagan community provides no shortage of videos discussing personal healing and shielding and light work, positive vibes, maintaining hope and thanksgiving in all its myriad forms. And as always, forgiveness and empathy seem to stand center stage as stratagem prima in the battle against emotional pain. And most of us probably have a fairly regular, hopefully very regular self-care practice, which helps us in unburdening from ourselves a lot of the strain, stress, and negativity that we may swallow over the course of days or weeks. But like I said, every so often, the basics just don't cut it. Like many people, I am a work in progress. And one of the issues I run into is an intense, visceral, emotional response to the political landscape. To stuff that isn't fucking political, but is politicized. For me, this sort of thing manifests as a combination between something that borders on a depressive episode and absolute fury. And I think it's relatively important that one cater one's response, one's spiritual response to the way we manifest discontent or hurt or what have you. Because I don't think that all spiritual approaches or all orthopraxic approaches to coping with these different means of manifesting strong negative emotion are interchangeable. There are certainly cases in which one form of practice or meditation is better suited and more effective for me when I'm in state X, and pretty much useless when I'm in state Y. And this is something that is certainly going to differ for all of us. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to coping. Not at the level of execution, anyway. And so I thought I would just chat a little bit about some of the things that I've found have been helpful that don't necessarily get a lot of airtime, that may deviate a little bit from what a lot of people do, on the off chance it may provide inspiration or insight to anybody else experiencing something similar, or for the next time you find yourself in a comparable situation. It's easy enough for me to recognize when I'm hitting the point of becoming too emotionally wrought. And it's not difficult for me to identify the key underlying features. Again, we're talking about heartbreak, depression, sadness, hurt, and rage, anger, the state of being absolutely fucking livid. What can be harder to determine, though, is what additional baggage my own internal reactions to my emotional state are adding on top of all that. And I think it can be quite valuable to spend some time trying to identify those things because they tend to worsen the situation. They also tend to be the aspects of one's worsening state that are easiest to interrupt. And frequently, simply identifying them, recognizing them, naming them can make a huge difference. For me, some of the ways in which I worsen my own hurt and anger are with feelings like I can't do anything about this situation, or I don't know how to act, or I'm struggling with the ethics of acting. Emotionally, I want to act a certain way. Rationally, I doubt its productivity. And these, of course, are hardly novel manifestations of frustration. Feelings of impotence and inevitability are one of those great mental illusions that really contribute a lot to us sinking deeper into whatever negative states we happen to be in at the moment. But in recognizing this tendency within myself, I can respond by focusing on a problem that is in fact solvable. First, by parsing and differentiating between my capacity to act on my own state versus my capacity to act on the cause of my state, and then coming up with a plan to tackle those things in isolation. Step one, I think, is trying to talk yourself off the ethical ledge. Whatever that line is for you that you may find problematic were you in a calmer state. And these ethics or ideals of right thought and right action may be mundane, they may be related to spellcraft. Either way, generally speaking, it's not in one's best interest to pile guilt on top of whatever other emotional distress one may be experiencing. I'll come back to the question of action and dealing with the problem of feeling like one cannot act or doesn't know how to act in a moment, because I first want to talk just a little bit about some of the things that I've done that I find useful to use in addition to the other tried and true means of dispelling negative states. One of the classic traps and pitfalls of depressive states also holds true for me in states of extreme anger and frustration, and that's a tendency to ruminate, for my thoughts to focus again and again on the thing that causes distress, so that those thoughts end up reinforcing that distress. And after 30 some odd years of practice, I'm pretty good at that, which means it's particularly crucial for me to engage my mind elsewhere, to forcibly interrupt that tendency when I notice it's starting to get going. Now I can pull that off while at the same time fine-tuning my practice to ensure that I am taking extra good care of myself and am particularly focused on my internal states and well-being by spending a bunch of time with paper and pen and writing out entirely new devotionals, entirely new circle casting and closing, entirely new calls to elements, deity, what have you. Crafting a ritual from the very ground up, using the kinds of words, kinds of message I need to hear right now. And then, when that's written, memorizing it. Now, I know not everybody uses explicit phrasing, speaking, or utterances in their practice, nor am I suggesting that everybody needs to. I do, and I think that in this case it's advantageous, because it calls for a level of mental focus that makes it very difficult for your brain to run off down some avenue of ire and wrath. The act of creating new calls, new circle castings, new devotionals that are truly tailored to the sort of negative emotional state you personally manifest when shit's going bad also means that you will have created a tailor-made balm for that state, and that simultaneously you won't form negative associations or have any of that sort of toxicity rub off on the other more established aspects of your practice. because one of the problems I think we can occasionally run into is that when we hit an emotional rough patch, the more automatic and well-established aspects of our practice, if they aren't quite enough to really soothe whatever wounds we're nursing, well, that can lead to a sort of disappointment, a feeling of being let down by these aspects of one's practice that can then sort of suck some of that magic, that hard-won magic, away from those established parts of our craft. The same can be said, too, for the visual, mental, or astral imagery we employ. Now, many of us probably have some sort of mental or astral altar. I have a fairly diverse collection of these spaces, each of which is more optimal in some cases than in others. And since such real estate is essentially infinite, I don't think there's any downside to constructing an astral space, including an astral altar, that is tailor-designed to soothe, alleviate, and protect you from your current emotional toll. Nor does this space need to be one that is only employed specifically for acts of soothing, but can be used as a primary workspace over the days or weeks that it takes to recover a more normal emotional footing, whatever that may be for you. The very act of designing such a space can be therapeutic. The careful consideration of what you add and what you leave out is one that, from the jump, I notice settles me and helps to drain tension away. Now, once we have exhausted some mental energy and interrupted rumination by writing and memorizing words that themselves will help ground us and set a healthier emotional tone, and we have a space that is optimized for use during periods of emotional tumult, we can return to this question of action. What can we do? Again, this is really two questions in my case and in this situation here, because what I can do for myself and what I can do about the thing that has landed me in this land of contemptuous frustration are different. There are a lot of ways one can act in the outside world, whether it's supporting a cause, showing up at rallies yourself, donating, speaking out. And it is my personal belief that it is not enough to unburden ourselves emotionally. That pain wrought by violence and injustice really should always be answered with tangible action. So great, okay, I can do that. But some of that emotional conflict I discussed before, not knowing what I can do, not knowing about ethical lines, those weren't issues that applied to tangible, mundane action. Those were questions that emerged within my practice, about my practice. Those are points of internal conflict born of the desire to act without knowing whether I can trust that instinct. The challenge comes from seeking a means, an act of opposition and defiance that does not cross the line over into vengeance and wishing outright harm. And although I absolutely believe it's possible to do this, I also recognize that while in the heat of emotional hurt or anger, that line may tend to get a little fuzzier than we may prefer. And so I want to spend the rest of this video talking about a ritual act that I think meets the criteria of opposition, one that has the capacity to heal, but that doesn't cross the line into hexing, cursing, what have you. Which is to say that I'd like to talk a bit about what I've lately been thinking might be an underappreciated opposite of the sort of ritual thanksgiving many of us practice, namely ritual censure. It's actually kind of surprising to me that censure is so rarely discussed in modern witchy circles, considering how frequently it appears in myth. I wonder whether it's because it was the repercussions of that sort of censure, the condemnation, curses, punishment, the revenge that captured popular attentions foremost and first, rather than the ritual reproach and declarations of wrongdoing themselves. But just as acknowledging one's fortunes is not the same as providing offerings of thanks, neither is acknowledging harm or villainy the same as exacting revenge. Acknowledgement precedes action, and I've come to think that this sort of acknowledgement has power all its own, including the power to heal. The ceremonial recognition of transgressions is pervasive in most societies, as is a general, if unspoken, recognition of its importance. Whether it's the formal delivery of a verdict in court, or that old bit of wisdom that sunlight heals all wounds, the public revelation of our or others' wrongdoing is powerful. It's a validation and act of support for those wronged. It's a balm and a threshold leading past a place of pain. And it's a threshold that doesn't require forgiveness per se to cross. The concept of catharsis, that is, purification through emotional confrontation and release, dates back to ancient Greece, but most of us probably encountered the concept thanks to its resurgence during the popularization of psychoanalytic theory. And whatever our personal opinions on Freud's work, I suspect many of us would agree that there is something to the idea of releasing pent-up emotions through unfettered reenactment. That is, by allowing ourselves to experience those emotions intensely and truly. The problem is that true catharsis is difficult to achieve publicly. If you were able to hear inside my head at the beginning of the week, you would probably appreciate acutely why it's so difficult to air our true emotions in public. The emotions themselves are nasty, unpleasant, and in sharing them, we necessarily run the risk of spreading them around. Emotions are contagious, and these sorts of emotions readily ruin others' good days and drastically color others' perceptions of us when we speak them. Strong negative emotions are also often taboo, strong anger doubly so, and the line between which is the greater transgression, the emotion itself or its public display, is difficult to discern, nor is it easy to disentangle nasty emotions from their perceived cause. When we're angry, we lash out incoherently at the thing harming us. We cross verbal lines that we would never physically breach. We vocally flail, looking for the magic combination of words that will ease our suffering and strike the heart of what pains us. And in the heat of anger, we often betray our own ideals regarding thoughtful intent, regarding empathy, enlightenment, justice. I imagine that, like me, most of you are thoroughly aware of your own imperfections, and that awareness becomes acute when we bear them in ire and feelings of wrath. In expressing our emotions, we come to feel that we've consigned ourselves to being overwhelmed by them, to failure. Because of these taboos and implications, even when negative emotions and the railing against their cause pours out of us in front of another person, a part of us is often simultaneously trying to rein it in and to keep some small piece of our shit together, which means that these displays rarely achieve what we hope they will. We are not emptied by them. We're not cleansed. Catharsis slips out of reach, and with it, redemption. The embarrassment or sense that we may have crossed the line, that our outburst is unproductive or even counterproductive, may keep us from publicly airing our grievances again, at least for a while. But then not only haven't we done ourselves much good, we've added shame or personal disappointment to the mix, and we double down on suppressing those feelings as well, embedding them deeper. Just as likely, though, when we punch through the dam and fail to empty that reservoir of anger, we hamper our ability to squash further emotional uprising. We may find that our rage erupts again and again, and in so doing we sort of become the person people think of as always angry, not because we're actually any angrier than we were before, but because it's always on display. It becomes very difficult to bury or hide. It's always one innocent comment away from being loosed upon whatever unwitting person made the mistake of bringing up the thing that's damaged us. All of which is to say that our best approach to achieving something like catharsis, of really letting go, of being uninhibited and emptying that reservoir of anger, is doing so alone in circle, where we can rage and scream and empty ourselves until every ugly drop has been poured into an energetic container built for the purpose. Bringing this ugly into circle may not be something everybody is comfortable doing, and that's fine. For others, sacred space is incompatible with uncontrolled affect. My own views, however, do not require stringent formality in sacred space, nor strict emotional control at all times. I think raw emotion, even very negative emotions, can be loosed in circle in a safe and ultimately positive way, provided one sets the parameters by which those emotions take shape upon release. Which is to say, I personally think it's best to be clear about the distinction between the thoughts and words used to release negative emotions I'm housing within myself, and the thoughts and words used to release those emotions from the circle into the world. Because uncontrolled, raw emotion, like rage and the shit that we say when we're experiencing it and releasing it, is wildfire. These two acts are very different, and the line between them is one I feel it's crucial to keep stark and unbending in my own mind. As always, the intent and its ritual representation are key here. The release of internally held rage is ideally bracketed by something like statements or acts denoting that the words or the emotions shared during the act are not ones I seek to manifest. Rather, my firm intent is their quarantine within the working space and outside of myself. And there should be no ambiguity about this in one's mind, I think. This way, during the initial act of release, during the attempt at achieving catharsis, I can avoid placing limitations on what emotions I'm willing to reveal, nor do I need to edit the toxic thoughts or words that are their byproduct. The goal is catharsis through the drawing out of mental toxins. Artificial limitations on what feelings, thoughts, or words are allowed is therefore counterproductive. And this includes feelings of regret and sadness at even having housed such vile feelings to begin with. I'll rail against them all until I'm spent and there is nothing left to say. This is my catharsis, and for me, I think it's the first necessary step of my censure. Necessary to ensure that that censure is not something that is at odds with my personal ethics. After having allowed myself to dump out as much of that negative emotion as I possibly can, it's then time to very clearly mark the end of that cathartic phase of the ritual. Because the sort of uncontrolled emotional behavior we've just displayed has no place in what follows. Namely, the refunneling of all of that released emotion into the writing of the censure itself. In writing this censure, I will keep my words clear and plain. My choice of words is now as careful and even-handed as it was uncontrolled and hyperbolic during cathartic release. And this is because the point of my censure isn't to blame others for the emotions they evoke in me. At the end of the day, they aren't actually responsible for the specific way my emotions manifest, even if they are responsible for their own explicit efforts to evoke negative emotions in others. Nor, when I write my censure, is my goal to call for punishment or retribution. Like I said, acknowledgement precedes action. I want my censure to be based in fact, to be an unequivocal, if abbreviated, accounting of what I perceive as wrongdoing. And above all, I seek to make one thing in particular very clear, that I stand opposed to the person or persons that I am censuring. Because ultimately, I think this is the core point of censure and a central source of its power. It's a means of saying, I deem your actions wrong and I defy them and their place in the world I'm helping to build. We speak often about the world we live in, but this choice of phrasing omits the reality that we don't just live in it, we construct it. The world wears the face we will her take, and none of us are required to willingly yield ground in her shaping to those whose views are fundamentally incompatible with the core tenets of justice or morality. The words that appear in acts of censure may often materialize as enumerations of wrongdoing, but the message is, I reject your claims of righteousness in what you have done. I declare your actions unjust and without place. And in engaging in ritual censure, I am doing more than simply stating these beliefs, this opposition aloud. I am standing before everything I hold sacred and declaring my opposition unequivocally and with the same level of commitment as I displayed during my initiation or my dedication. And so ultimately, the act of censure is not an attack, it's a line in the sand. It is the naming of names and a reaffirmation of what you believe, of what you stand for, and a commitment that, whatever the emotional toll, you will hold the line. As ever, I do wish you wellness and joy, and I hope that whoever might be in a state to use any of this finds the release and the strength they need.